Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to Top 10 Middle Game Ideas number 3, the Pillsbury Attack. And in this video I'm going to round out my coverage of the Pillsbury Attack with some examples. And I wanted to start with this game between Pillsbury and Emanuel Schiffers. Schiffers has the black pieces. This was played in Austria in 1898, played in Vienna. So this is a typical position, the starting position of the Pillsbury Attack. Let's go back to the beginning just to remind you of how we get to a setup like that. So it starts off as a Queen's Gambit declined. E6, declining the Queen's Gambit. Now Knight C3, Knight F6, these are the normal moves, putting pressure on the center and defending the center. And Bishop to G5, that's Pillsbury's main way of playing this position, getting the bishop out of the pawn chain, outside the pawn chain before playing E3 and setting up a solid center. So Bishop E7, unpinning E3 now, black castles, white goes Knight F3. Let's see, B6. Black is going for the Tartakover setup. It's a way to deal with the development problem of this bishop in the in these Queen's Gambit positions where it's often blocked in along this diagonal, giving it another diagonal here to go after on B7, or even on A6. Actually, as we'll see in this game, there's a possibility of Bishop A6. Pillsbury at this point decides to exchange on D5, bringing a pawn to that square, and with the idea of keeping this bishop kind of blocked out of the game by this pawn in the center. So Bishop to D3 now, Bishop B7, Knight E5, and Knight B D7, challenging that knight in the center, and F4. So that's the we completed the Pillsbury setup. We've got this solid pawn formation in the center, and the advanced knight on E5. And so this is a position which is okay for both sides. And we'll see Schiffers plays pretty well at the beginning. And he chooses an interesting way to try and lessen the attacking pressure on the king side. He goes knight to E4. Now notice that he doesn't want to play knight takes E5 at this point. That would just bring a pawn forward. It would give white control or chase this knight away from the F6 square, and that's actually a pretty good structure for white. Sometimes you need to do that exchange just to get rid of this annoying knight here, but it's a bit early to commit to that. And now Schiffers has a different idea, which is better. Plays knight to E4, opening up this diagonal and exchanging off this dangerous attacking bishop, the dark squared bishop. So Pillsbury takes, Queen takes, and now Pillsbury decides to get rid of this knight. He doesn't like the knight on E4. And notice this knight E4 would not be possible except for the fact that the bishop is here defending that pawn and the bishop, because there's two pieces covering that square. But after the exchange, we'll see that that pawn is defended by the bishop, and so it's held there for the moment. White castles and black plays F5, and that's a way of permanently securing this pawn on E4, so that well, the bishop is free to go elsewhere, but also, you know, that pawn could have come under attack with a move like Queen to C2, for example. It would have been hard to defend. So, well, I don't know if it's too hard to defend. I guess he also had the idea of knight to F6 would have been to defend it, but he chose to defend it this way. Maybe it's a bit of a controversial decision because it does open up the king side a bit, but we'll see in this game that Schiffers' idea is to proceed or to meet the Pillsbury attack with a counterattack on the king side, so he's not too worried about this. In this position, Pillsbury continued with G4, just straightforward king side attack, pushing those pawns. The chess engine actually prefers Queen B3 check. It's not so keen to weaken the king side just yet. Wants to play a little bit with the pieces. Queen B3 check. Say the king goes here, and rook to C1, just activating the pieces and getting a good setup. And this is okay, and maybe it's better than what Pillsbury played in a technical sense. But, well, this is the Pillsbury attack, and this is the way he plays it. And it's still a very dangerous attack. Let's see. At this point, Schiffers decides to trade off that knight, so he takes, and white does get this this advanced pawn, but we'll see if that becomes a factor later in the game. Again, Schiffers is thinking about his own pawns and how he can exploit some sort of pressure on the king side that he can generate. He comes out here with queen to g5, immediately threatening this pawn on g4, which yeah, Pillsbury does not really want to allow the g file to be open, so he defends that pawn. Well, he can't take because it's pinned, but he defends that pawn with the rook. So now, if there's an exchange, the rook will take back and chase the queen off of the king side, and the white's king will be pretty secure. But Schiffers continues with h5. He's not going to take. He's not going to take that for an answer. He's going to try and increase the pressure. So now Pillsbury goes for queen b3 check, chasing the king to h7. And that got the queen off the back rank with tempo and allowed him to bring the rook to f1. So he's doubled on the f file. At this point, Schiffers takes, so he's pawn up. And Pillsbury plays d5. This is kind of interesting. If you look at this, you know, the rooks and the queen are all looking at the king side, and looks like he's set up for a king side attack. But the knight's not yet participating. You wonder if maybe that knight needs to be repositioned. But he has a different idea here. He plays d5. And now you can see maybe one of the drawbacks, another one of the drawbacks of that exchange. Pillsbury now has two pawns that are encroaching on black's camp, and this d-pawn is actually a dangerous passed pawn. So Schiffers doesn't immediately react to that, but he pushes on with g3, which is something that needs to be dealt with. He's threatening to open up this g file with a check on the king. Pillsbury, naturally enough, doesn't want the g file open. He's going to leave this pawn here as a shield for his king, and he just plays the move h4, chasing the queen away and keeping that g file closed. The queen drops back to e7 here, taking a look at the d pawn, and it's interesting, Pillsbury doesn't immediately defend the d-pawn, but plays queen d1. So the idea here is that if black takes the d-pawn, then Pillsbury's queen comes over here with check. So Schiffer stops that first with this g6 move, and now Pillsbury continues with h5. Once again, keeping up the pressure on the king side and not bothering to deal with this immediate threat to the d-pawn. But, well, this is serious enough that Schiffers decides to play king to g7 here, get it out of the line of fire of those checks on the h-file. And now queen to d4 was played, defending that pawn and looking at the king through this diagonal. And so right here, I think this is the point where the evaluation starts to shift. This has been kind of a struggle. It's been going back and forth. If you look at it with the chess engine, you will find an advantage for white at some point and an advantage for black at other points. And it's kind of the nature of the Pillsbury attack. It's not like an automatic win, but it's just something that you keep maneuvering and poking and prodding and looking for ways to open up your opponent's king and break through. And eventually you might find a way. The chess engine has a couple of ideas here for black to defend. One is bishop to a6, an idea that I mentioned before, and another idea is c5, just pushing this c-pawn forward and forcing white to either break up this pawn duo or by taking en passant or moving the queen. So this would help black. What black played here was a pretty logical move, I think, rook to d8, just putting your rooks in front of those passed pawns. But at this point, actually, white's attack is now winning. It starts with e6 check. Of course, it's not it's not an immediate breakthrough, but this seems to be the key turning point in the game. So anyway, chasing the king goes to h6. There's no queen coming into h8 because this is all pretty firmly under control by black. So the king seems safe there for the moment. But now h takes g6, opening up the h-file, so the king might get exposed. King takes on g6. Queen to e5, creeping in with the queen. The queen goes over to h7. Cancel that. h7. Okay, and coming with an immediate threat, that is checkmate. So there's one and only one move here. If you want to put on your thinking cap, there is one and only one move here for white that is winning. There's one move that is drawing and the rest lose. So see if you can find the one winning move for white in this position. Okay, it might pause the video if you want time to think about it. I am going to give the answer away now. It might be, it's one of those moves that really surprised me when I first saw it, but it has a certain logic to it. There's only so many ways you can defend against that mate threat, and this is one of them. And when you place that rook on f2, not only does it defend against the mate threat, it also opens up this diagonal so that this pawn can be taken and the g-file towards black's king is opened, and this is just completely winning. And so it's interesting. I mean, black has been winning, as I said, ever since that rook to d8 move was played, which he followed up. I mean, white has been winning ever since black played rook d8. But I wonder if Pillsbury was able to calculate ahead far enough to see this move and know it was a win, or if he had to discover it at this point on the board. Either way, it's a pretty nice move. Okay, so, well, what should black do? Probably just take the rook. There's nothing better. But, well, unfortunately, there's no more mate threat. And even though white is a whole rook down, white's attack is just winning here. It's amazing. So queen to h6. Just preparing, I guess, to block some of these threats against the king. Let's see, rook to g2 was played. King went to h7. Okay, yeah, the queen was getting out of the way so that the king had an escape square. But, well, this is going to lose to rook to h7 there. But first, Pillsbury throws in queen takes c7 check. Drives the king back to h8. Queen comes... Oh, the queen stays there. And now he plays rook h2, skewering the queen and the king. Black throws in rook g8 check. King to f2. And then goes for the exchange. I mean, there's nothing better. You can't help exchanging that queen for the rook. And so now, for a second, it looks like, well, maybe black could survive this, but in fact, it's pretty hopeless. Where can the king run to? It's only squares, really. King g7, and the queen comes back here with check, and Pillsbury is going to pick up another piece here. In addition to that, he's got these advanced pawns as an immediate threat. Let's go ahead and play through the rest of the game. We went king to h6 to get out of the check. Pillsbury grabbed the bishop. The queen got chased away. And then the knight comes around. And he's going for some counterplay on the g-file, but Pillsbury got his knight to the f4 square just in time. So still going for some counterplay with those rooks. And now Pillsbury gets these pawns marching. Rook h2, the king runs. And then after a couple more moves here, yeah, he brings his knight back. The knight is doing a pretty good job here of defending against checks on both sides. And at this point, there's no way that black is going to be able to stop those pawns from advancing. So he decided to resign at this point. So an interesting game. Let's take a look at the next example. This next game was played in Havana in 2009. I had trouble actually finding a game between truly top-level players with this setup, but let's see, the black player on this side in this game had a rating of over 2,000, and the rating of the white player is not given in the database. But anyway, it seemed to be a pretty interesting game. It started off d4, d5, and now white went with knight f3. Black played e6, so slight variation in move order, but we still get a queen's gambit declined position after c4, knight f6, and white still goes with the early bishop g5, getting the bishop outside the pawn chain before playing e3. So knight bd7 and knight to c3, pretty logical moves, bishop e7 and e3. And notice that black got this knight to d7 move in early. So when the knight hops to e5, there's always a chance or possibility of the exchange of the knight on e5. So you have to take that into account if you're trying to get this set up with the white pieces. b6 was played, so going for the Tartakover setup on the black side. C takes d5, e takes d5, the typical exchange. Bishop d3, castles, castles, bishop b7, and now white does go with knight e5. And actually in this position, it is possible to do the exchange. It seems to be an okay position. After the take, knight takes, pawn takes, the knight, notice the knight can't come to g5. Sometimes that's an interesting idea because the knight on g5 takes a look at the, g4 rather, takes a look at the e3 pawn. So that sort of inhibits you from playing the move f4 there to defend the e pawn because it leaves the e3 pawn undefended. But in this case, you can't play knight to g4. It's guarded by the queen, so the knight dropped back to d7, would drop back to d7. This wasn't actually played. Bishop takes, queen takes, and then f4. And this is a position where white has got some of what he wanted. He's got that kingside attack set up with the advanced e-pawn, but it's also a position that black can hold, so it seems to be okay for both sides. Anyway, in this game, black didn't choose to play that way, but went with c5, undermining the center, not so quickly deciding to trade off that knight, but now this gives time for white to play the f4 move, and we have the typical position of the Pillsbury attack here. So h6, this is the modern way of playing it. They almost always kick the bishop first. I guess it's useful to have a little bit of control over that g5 square in any case, and when the bishop is kicked back here, it has fewer options after this knight moves. So a logical follow-up from this point, actually black's next move is a mistake, but I wanted to give an idea of how to defend against the Pillsbury attack. I'm not going to do a separate video on the defense. I'll just talk about it here. And as I mentioned in the previous video, a good way is to exchange off that dark squared bishop. So you can start with this h6 move to kick the bishop back. You can exchange here on d4. Cancel that. Yeah, c takes d4, right. Just to weaken the center a little bit, e takes d4 will typically be played to keep that knight strong there. And then now knight e4 can be played and provoke this exchange. And once again, notice that the bishop on b7 there is doing a good job of defending that knight. So after the exchange, and then rook c1, it looks like this is an okay position for black. It looks like white is doing okay as well, but that's one way to play it. You have ideas. Actually, you can't, one thing to watch out for, I guess maybe I should put it this way, is that after you've played this h6 move, you can almost never play f6 because this square on g6 is too weak, and in this particular case it would fork those two pieces. So that is one downside of the h6 move, is it's weakening that g6 square. But I guess this trade is always possible. Anyway, it seems to be an okay position. I wanted to point out one thing that white needs to watch out for. There's this kind of clever tactic here in this position where if white had moved the other rook and played something like rook e1, just trying to gang up on this knight. I mean, this is a pretty logical move, trying to win a pawn here. Black can defend the knight with the move knight d to c5, putting it on a square where it can just be taken. And this is okay for black. Actually, white shouldn't take that. If he takes, queen takes c5, king here, and there's a mate happening because that's the famous smothered mate. This square is not protected when that rook moved from f1 to e1 to attack that knight in the center. It gave up control of that f2 square. And so yeah, there's a smothered mate or a Philidor mate in the offing with knight to h3 double check, or check. And the the queen coming in after the knight. Yeah, it's a double check after the king goes back to g8. So anyway, a cute mate there. So there are dangers for white. You have to be careful, but keeping this rook on the f f file here is a good start. You kind of want it to be on the f file anyway to help push that pawn forward. Okay, but as I said, black made a mistake in this position and played rook to c8, and after this white's attack really gained steam. White starts with queen f3, black plays c4. That was black's idea, was to just push these pawns forward and keep the center closed. And now rook to e8, g4, so typical Pillsbury style, pushing those kingside pawns forward, knight to h7. And already there's a little tactic here with bishop takes h7, dragging the king away from defensive f7, and the knight can grab on f7. So black can, or white can win a pawn there. But white has a bigger game in mind. White continues pushing the pawn forward with g5. Black takes. And now the trade, bishop takes, king takes, allows the queen to come in with check. Drives the king back, and now the queen takes f7 check. And so now at this point, black is really wishing that he had traded off that knight when he had the chance, because at this point it's too late. And we can see one of the key squares that that knight influences is that f7 square. So when the rook left the f file to go over here to the e file, that created those weaknesses. So anyway, it's all over at this point. The king goes to h7, and f takes g5. The pawn is threatening to come forward, and it looks like there's some kind of mate in the offing over here on the h file. For a second, it looks like black is holding because bishop takes. He has to get rid of that threat. And if white is a little bit incautious here and just plays the reflexive recapture, bishop takes g5, then actually it's turned around and black is doing fine in this position. It's a little better. So these positions are very sharp, but of course you're not obliged to take. Queen to g6 check is the next move, driving the king to the back rank. I think, yeah, he went to g8, and now the rook comes in, and black resigned. So nice short game, but showing some ideas how it is played these days. And then there's one more game I wanted to show you. This is not the last game I wanted to look at is not actually a Pillsbury Attack. This was what I wanted to illustrate with this game is how the idea of the Pillsbury Attack sometimes lurks behind common opening lines. So this was a game played between Etienne Bacrot and Viswanathan Anand. So Bacrot and Anand. It was played in 2006. It was actually a blitz game, but they're probably in their opening book in the beginning. Started off as a Nimzo Indian. So we get c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. But actually transposes after a few moves. Knight f3, castles, bishop g5. Notice that the bishop is coming outside the pawn chain. h6 to kick the bishop, it drops back, and d5. And at this point, we've actually transposed into a Queen's Gambit declined. This is the Rogozin variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. It's a way of playing the Queen's Gambit with as black with the bishop out to b4. And an interesting and pretty topical line. It's shown up in a number of top-level games. So let's continue on a few moves. e3, knight bd7. Takes. So we get this typical exchange on d5, bringing that pawn forward and getting rid of the e pawn in exchange for the c pawn. Bishop to d3, c5, castles. There's this exchange on c3, a typical Nimzo Indian type exchange. Queen to a5. I wanted to diverge right here, and there's actually two moves in the database at this point: queen a5 and c4. And I wanted to look at this line: c4. Kicks the bishop back, and then in this position, I looked at this position with the chess engine, and there's three moves. first of all, there's two moves that are in the database. There's queen to a5 and rook to e8, and those are the two ways of playing it. And you'll notice that one thing those two moves have in common is that they both stop the knight e5 idea. If the rook goes to e8, then knight e5 is stopped directly because black will exchange off the knight and just win a pawn there. In the other case, if the queen goes to a5, you can't play knight e5 immediately because of the threat to the c3 pawn that needs to be dealt with first. So, but the third choice in the chess engine is actually the move queen to b6. And this does allow the move knight to e5. And so, and it's good in this case. You want to keep an eye out for opportunities like this. I guess that's my point, is that if you're playing the white side and you see a chance to get in this kind of setup, it's often really favorable. So right now in this particular case, it's not good to exchange off that knight because it opens up the d file, and that pawn, well, the bishop would have to trade off that knight first, but the pawn comes there and chases that knight away. That's right. There's other times when it's not favorable to trade that knight off because of the pin. If the queen were still back on d8, for example, there'd be a pin. Here, in this case, the knight is doing an important job defending the d pawn, so you don't want to allow it to be chased away. So anyway, the response from black here, and the best move and the most logical one, is rook e8, now really threatening to take that knight, but now you get in the move f4. So that's a way you can get into a setup like the Pillsbury attack, and this is a pretty good setup for white. The chess engine thinks white has a strong advantage here, and so it looks like it's one of these cases where the straightforward attack just works. So that's the point I wanted to make, is whenever you're in these Queen's Gambit types of positions, even if it comes from a different move order, if you can get your bishop outside the pawn chain and get to this setup, sometimes that's something to keep an eye out for. It won't show up so often in top-level games, but you might have the opportunity in your own games to get that kind of setup just because people won't be playing the most exact move order. So, look for those opportunities at any point in your games. And then one last thing I wanted to talk about before I wrap up this video. I was going to, when I planned out this series in the beginning, I was also going to include the Stonewall Attack and with the Pillsbury Attack because it's a very similar kind of setup. But since then, I've already done a video on the Stonewall Attack. I did it as part of the Opening Basics series. So what I will do is I'll just put a link to the that video on this video here, so you can follow it up with a look at the Stonewall Attack. I'll just show you what the Stonewall Attack is, and we can talk briefly about the similarities and differences between these two setups. The reason why I wanted to kind of roll them in together is they have a very similar, they have the same pawn structure. So the Stonewall Attack goes like this. I'll just give the main line here: d4, d5, e3. Not bothering with any knight moves or the c4 move, just going directly for the solid center. Knight f6, typical response. Bishop d3. Notice that white is avoiding developing that knight. So c5 from black, logical move, trying to undermine the center. c3, defending it. Knight to c6, developing the knight to a good square. Now f4. So this is a key difference between the Pillsbury attack and the Stonewall Attack. The Stonewall Attack, you set up this pawn formation first, so there's no trouble getting the knight to e5. The knight can always go to e5, well, unless black manages to get in the move f6, but the knight can almost always get to e5. And you get into this setup much more quickly, but there's a penalty to pay, and the penalty you pay is that this bishop is inside the pawn chain instead of outside the pawn chain. Anyway, the line continues e6, and then black goes with knight f3, bishop e7, castles, knight bd2, a6, and knight to e5. And this is the basic position of the Stonewall Attack. And well, in the video I do on the Stonewall Attack, you can see different options that black has along the way, and also the attacking ideas that white has from this position. But there's a lot of similarities between these attacks and the Pillsbury attack, so it's good to take a look at that one for some additional attacking ideas from this kind of formation. Another similarity between the Stonewall attack and the Pillsbury attack is that if the initial attack is beaten back, there's still this kind of long-term pressure that white has because he's got this advanced pawn against the king, and he just needs to, in the long run, find a way to activate his pieces that are a little bit out of the game at the moment. For example, getting this bishop around to in some way so that it can participate. It could come out, I guess, on either side. Anyway, that's it for this series on the Pillsbury attack. Hope you enjoyed it, and stay tuned for Top 10 Middle Game Ideas number 4. I'll see you then. Bye.